Assalamu alaikum and hello. My name is Haider Ghani Jafari and I'm a senior year student at LUMS with a major in economics and mathematics. And so this presentation is for the course Advanced Macroeconomics. I'm going to start sharing my screen and dive into the topic. Right. So the topic that I've chosen is Margaret Thatcher's regime through the lens of the three equation model. The reason why I went for this topic is because I had watched the season The Crown. And after Sir discussed Margaret Thatcher and her era during the class, I was further intrigued to look at it through the lens of what was studied in class and apply it to her, period of prime ministership. So I chose this topic, and so I'm going to start with a brief background of who Margaret Thatcher is. She was the British Prime Minister of the UK from 1979 to 1990, and leader of the Conservative Party from 1975 to 1990. So during the time of her resignation, she accelerated the evolution of the British economy from statism to liberalism, and became the most renowned British political leader. So statism has to do with greater control of the government, or greater control at the center, while liberalism has more to do with free market economy and putting individual freedom at the center. So there are a few sort of policies she advocated for, starting from individualism, an end to allegedly excessive government interference in the economy, including privatization of state-owned enterprises, sale of public housing to tenants, reductions in expenditures on social services such as health and education, and having a tighter monetary policy, legal restrictions on trade unions. All of these terms and her policies, from constraints on labor movement to privatization to trying to bring low inflation. All of these terms were eventually summed into this word called Thatcherism, and a new term, the birth of a new term took place and is widely known in the economists. So moving on coming to power, the Conservatives followed a policy of monetarism, seeking to control the money supply, just what we've talked about, in order to control inflation. So this involved higher interest rates and higher taxes. Now, this did reduce inflation to 5% by 1983, just 4 years after Margaret Thatcher took power, but at the cost of a deep recession and unemployment rising to over 3 million. The two main channels through which the output is affected is the interest rate channel and exchange rate channel. I'm going to, in an open economy, I'm going to discuss them in greater detail. So to set the stage for our analysis of the three equation model in the open economy, it is important to analyze the two channels which affect the aggregate demand through the interest rate. So first of all, the first channel is that if we increase the interest rate, we can expect the investments to fall, because of course the higher interest rate means that the borrowing costs are greater, and so if investment falls, we know that aggregate demand is going to decrease. The second channel is that if we increase the interest rate, the return on the bonds or the local bonds such as the pounds would increase, and so bonds would be more attractive for international economy, their demand would increase, and eventually we can expect the currency to appreciate or E to decrease. When we know that the currency has appreciated, that means the exports are going to decline, and we know that if net exports decline, it is a component of the output, so aggregate demand also falls. So it is important to analyze these two channels which affect the output through the interest rates in these two equations. So the second graph that we're going to look at today is the uncovered interest parity condition. In this, we can see that if the interest rate rises, we can expect the local currency to be more attractive to the international market. And then what happens is that the demand for that currency increases, and hence we can expect, as the interest rate rises, we go from here to here, from point A to B, and we can expect the currency in this direction is the depreciation, in the opposite direction is the appreciation. So we can see that if there's a gain in the interest rate, that causes the currency to appreciate, and this is what the uncovered parity condition suggests, that the differential between the interest rate is translated into the differential or the corresponding change in the exchange rate. Right, so next I'm just going to quickly brief about the equations that we're going to use in the three equation model of the open economy. We have the IS curve. Here it is important to note, because this is the open economy, so Q is positively related with the IS. So if we expect the Q to depreciate, for instance, which means its value rises, that means the exports increase. So in a positive way, it's going to increase the IS curve. Likewise, it affects the same way the aggregate demand as well, because eventually it is the output which is going to be increased. Right, so for the medium run equilibrium, these are the conditions, and the inflation is constant.
Now, before we move on, I'm going to quickly talk about this little thing in the equilibrium rate of unemployment. We know that this is the wage setting curve and the price setting curve is what we use to determine the rate of unemployment. Now, because the unionization or decrease in union bargaining power is basically a supply shock. So now we're going to dive deeper into the three equation model and see how it adjusts back to equilibrium after a negative aggregate demand shock. Here it is important to look at the RX curve, which is the ideal position or the ideal point at which the central bank would want to be. And I have drawn it here in my interest rate versus output graph. Now what happens is that we're at point A, and with a negative aggregate demand shock, we can expect the output to decline at each level of interest rate. So the IS curve shifts to the left. At this point, we are at point B, and looking at the second graph, we can expect the inflation to be lower than what the target is or what the central bank aspires to achieve. This is not a suitable position. So what happens is that the central bank now wants to move to the RX curve. And for that, it will anticipate the new Phillips curve for the next period. After doing so, we can expect the Phillips curve to look something like this. And this, suppose central bank decides that this is the point at which it wants to be. And so taking this upwards, this is where we come on the RX curve. Now to come here from point B, the central bank will need to reduce its interest rate to R naught. So the central bank does that, and in doing so, it comes from point B to point C. And from here, we can expect to go back to this new inflation, pi naught dash, for example. And in the third model, we can expect to go back from B to again point C, but this point C is not going to be exactly on the aggregate demand curve, and that is because, as we mentioned in the last equations, the aggregate demand curve makes an assumption that R, the interest rate, is equal to the world interest rate, which is R star. But here we're not at the world interest rate. The central bank reduced R naught, and so as we know, reducing R naught increases our investment. So at each level of exchange rate, we can expect the output, the overall output, because of the increased investment, to be greater. So we will not be on the AD curve exactly, we'll be somewhere over here. Now, so we are at point C, but now we know that the interest rate is lower. The interest rate being lower affects the investment. We studied the two channels, right? So the lower interest rate increases investment, and so it increases output. But the lower interest rate also means that it depreciates the pound, the local currency, and hence increases the net exports, and so the output rises. And for that reason, we can expect the IS curve to shift in the right direction. And so this is how we come back to point C in the first graph. Now we're in part C. We know that the Q has depreciated, and so it has depreciated from this point to C, which is this total depreciation is greater than what it should be, and there's an initial overshooting of the exchange rate. We're not at the equilibrium, which was supposed to be this. We're not there yet, but we are above the equilibrium. And so this is an overshooting of the exchange rate, and this takes us to the whole narrative around Margaret Thatcher's regime and what exactly happened. But before going into that, we're going to quickly discuss how it comes back to equilibrium. We know that the interest rate is lower. The central bank is going to adjust the interest rate back and bring the IS curve to the left, and eventually we're going to come back to our initial equilibrium, call it Z. This is how we move here, and this is how we're going to move in the third graph. And so this is the final equilibrium that we expect it to come back. From this negative demand shock, we can see that there's an overshooting happening. There was initial overshooting, and then the exchange rate comes back here. And so this portion is the difference in the equilibrium exchange rate and the initial overshooting. And the actual equilibrium depreciation is from this point C to this point, which was the initial point B. So this is the final equilibrium depreciation.
So now we're going to look at why overshooting happens. So the role of rational expectations comes into play. Rational expectations play a huge role in the forex market because people anticipate and very quickly anticipate the exchange rate, which is why Q adjusts very quickly. But on the other hand, wages or prices have adaptive expectations, and the thing about adaptive expectations is that people anticipate based on what they've seen in the history in the past, right? So that takes a bit of time, but with the forex market, people have rational expectations, and so Q adjusts really quickly. Now, I'm going to quickly have a brief overview of the key indicators in the actual Margaret Thatcher's regime, so as to reflect back onto and just compare our three equation model with what actually happened. So we know that inflation it actually rose in the beginning for some time, but then after that it started depressing. But we can see that inflation did not just immediately go down. It took a bit of a while. The interest rate, on the other hand, because in the UK, the government, it sets the, at that time it did have the authority to set the interest rate on their own, so it did have it could use it for their monetary policies. So in November 1979, the government raised interest rates to 17% in order to tackle inflation. Now this harmed the manufacturing industry and exports, but did eventually have the desired effect on inflation. And here we can see how initially, this white part is Margaret Thatcher's regime. I took this from BBC, and this is the beginning of a regime where they targeted high interest rates and later reduced them. Now the base rate was pushed up again towards the end. It was again to curb inflation, because eventually the inflation started rising again. Moving on to the GDP, we know that there has to be a period when based on our analysis, we did see that there has to be a period when output is below what it should be, below what the equilibrium should be. And so we see that GDP growth in this time was really low. It was below zero, and after that we did see a boom, right? And here I've also mentioned how we went from moving from A to point B in our analysis, which was basically coming down from the equilibrium output, and then going from B to further C, which was basically coming back to in fact greater than what our initial output was. And here we can see how there you see a boom, right? So this is the GDP. Moving on to the unemployment, we can kind of, because GDP can, or output can, give us a sense of unemployment, we can use the production function to derive. So we can see a bit of similarity there. We know that in the beginning unemployment rose because, of course, because of this recessionary period. But after that, when there was a boom, unemployment did decrease. Moving on to the exchange rate, which is the real thing here. So I got this number from Macro Trends. The pound began the 1980s worth $2.3, but in 1985 it touched a record low of $1.05. Now these numbers are they're the other way around from what we've studied in class. They're basically dollars per pound. So for the purposes of my analysis, I wanted to understand in greater depth. I converted them into the other in our usual exchange rate method. So that is the pounds per dollar. And in that, it turns out that the exchange rate went from 0.43 to 0.95. So this was an increase in the value of Q, which is basically an increase in the value on the axis shows a depreciation. So this shows the kind of overshooting that took place during the initial period of Margaret Thatcher's initial term, right? And this is very much reflective of the theory we've studied in the whiteboard. And finally, this was also one factor which we had not discussed in class with reference to Margaret Thatcher's regime, but I was further interested to know how unions played a role. And I found out that unions were actually curbed. They were put lots of constraints, and which is why we see that union membership also declined. And we did study in the initial graphical analysis how union constraints can lead to a depreciation of the exchange rate. And finally, I wanted to look at it through the lens of what we'd studied in class. So here's a good reflective, graph, sort of adjustment of the negative demand shock. And here we can see the kind of overshooting that takes place, which is reflective of this one here when it goes from B to C. So finally, moving on towards the conclusion, we know that Thatcher announced a reduction in the growth of the money supply with the objective of reducing inflation. But we know that, looking at the third point, an announcement of a lower money supply growth did not produce an immediate fall in inflation. And we can see that quickly in the inflation chart, which is right here. Yeah. So we know that this is when she came to power, somewhere around this time, and we see that there's an initial, increase in inflation, even though she did implement the policies as soon as she came to power, and a lot of people told her that you're really hurrying up, but she was like, "I am in a hurry." These were her words, and so she did implement her policies, but we did see an initial peak, and after which the policy started seeing an implementation, right? So, Dornbusch from the book pointed out that if the foreign exchange market expects that a period with output below its equilibrium level is required to bring prices down, then they will also expect a prolonged period where real interest rates will remain high. And that is exactly this point where we go from C to Z. We come to point B, but then we do expect that in the future there will come a point when interest rates will be higher, and that is what happened. So, in anticipation that a period of high interest rates was needed to push up in unemployment and squeeze inflation, the UK pound appreciated sharply below the announcement of the tight money policy. So there was an initial appreciation, which led to a depreciation later. And that is exactly what we've studied in the theory. So it's very much reflective of that. And the fall in inflation followed the rise in unemployment. So we can see that what we've studied in theory is very much reflective of the actual numbers. In fact, we can actually analyze it through different lenses, such as the union constraints and union power. So that's the analysis overall, but it is very important to make sure that we understand that understanding macroeconomic variables is a very hard phenomena. There are lots of factors come into play, which is why the UIP condition is often hard to observe in exchange rate data. And so there are other factors, such as the discovery of North Sea oil, for instance, which led to its exchange rates depreciation. But we can safely assume that the role of the interest rate, of course, was very, very obvious in curbing the inflation at a later period, and also seeing a boom later after a recession. So I'm going to end here with my analysis of Margaret Thatcher's regime. This is where the idea of Thatcherism took birth, and it has been it has been constantly critiqued and used as a way of argument by economists. Did it succeed or did it not? There are lots of factors to look at, but this is where I'm going to end with my topic of looking at Margaret Thatcher's regime through the lens of the three equation model in the open economy. Thank you very much.